out on the flats, out on basically where East Middle School is today. It's roughly the neighborhood, and I'll show you a map in a little bit. And I was scratching my head going, the track is on the east side of town, so why was it the West Side Racing Association? And then as I got over to Bozeman, I discovered they had the Eastern Montana Racing Association, and so it was a reference to being west of the Continental Divide. They finally built a big grandstand that seated 2,000 people. It wasn't the showplace one that you saw in 1914, but at that point in time, we start seeing Marcus Daly show up in the papers with mostly trotting horses. He had both thoroughbred racehorses and the harness racing, trotting, and pacing horses that today we call the standard bred. And he was starting to race in 1886. He was at the races all the time. He became a fixture of the place. And in 1888, the West Side Racing Association finally got around to incorporating. They, been running races for 10 years, but let's incorporate. And the original stockholders were people you would all recognize: W.A. Clark, M.J. Cottle, Marcus Daly, Henry Frank, John Noyes. Clark did keep a racing stable, but he did not have a real strong personal interest in it the way Daly did with his. Daly had a horse breeding operation. First he raised horses and stabled them over in Anaconda. He had horses in California, he had horses in Kentucky, he had horses in New York, and he also eventually bought a small stud farm in England, Apperfield Court, which was sort of his recruiting station for the best thoroughbreds in the world. Clark, on the other hand, turned most everything over to his son and to people he hired, and by the time Daly had passed away and Clark was becoming quite a national figure, the Daly racing form sort of dismissed Clark as a true horseman and alleged that his interest in horses was merely because it was yet one more way he was trying to vanquish Daly. So the Clark and Daly feud played out on the track as well as everywhere else across the state of Montana. The answer to where the track is was, I found this 1903 map, and you can see where there's an oval, and anytime I look at a map, I'm always looking for ovals. I have to be careful not to get too excited because human track and field maps also have ovals, dog tracks have ovals, and then after we get into the 20th century, race car tracks are ovals as well. But when you've got a mile oval, which is what most tracks were back in that day, because the harness horses, you're driving them in a cart, and you do not want to go around really tight turns in a two-wheel cart because you could wipe out and it wouldn't be pretty. So they also clocked the harness horses in how fast they could trot or pace what they called a standard mile, which was a mile that was very carefully measured, and they had to be able to do that in a certain amount of time in order to qualify to be in the registry. And so most of our early racetracks were mile ovals, and this one, based on the scale of miles, appears to be. So this was the West Side Racing Association track. You can see trolley line going right out there. They don't show all of the barns yet. In 1903, there were ultimately almost 30 horse barns out there. There's a Sanborn map I will show you in a little bit, where if you look at the entire map, they had the barns numbered A, lettered A through Z, and then they ran out of letters, and then they started to have barn double A, double B, double C, double D. I think they topped out at about 32 barns for horses. You can see, those of you that are familiar with Old Butte history, the Silver Bow Creek, the impoundments, and the rest of the town up in the top left corner. So that's basically where the track was, and in 1890, they were electrifying the trolley lines, and they made sure that that one trolley line went to the track. Now this begins the golden age. Montana reached the national scene in 1889, not because we became a state, but who knows why we got in the national news in 1889. It's a horse.
And won the Kentucky Derby.
Spokane, yes, a horse named Spokane won the Kentucky Derby. He was owned by Noah Armstrong down in Twin Bridges. That Doncaster Round Barn that's down there was where he was foaled, and then they sent him to Tennessee to be trained. He ran in the Kentucky Derby, he won, and then he won the next 2 races after that, completing what in those days was something of a Triple Crown at its time. And everybody began to think about, what's this about Montana? Maybe there's the bunch grass is superior to bluegrass, was one of the things you heard the promoters say. So, the next year, the race meet in Butte is very, very popular, and the Daily Racing Form is beginning to cover the meet, and that's the national newspaper for horse racing. And in 1890, this horse, his name was Bob Wade, he was known as the Beautiful Bay. He was a gelding, bless his heart. We do not know everything about his parentage. He had thoroughbred breeding on one side, and we're not really sure quite what on the other. But today, the quarter horse industry claims him as an early quarter horse. He was a quarter miler, that's what they called him in those days. And in 1890, he had a couple of rivals that were racing each other all over the West, but they hadn't really met up in a race that anybody could really agree with. There was Nettie S., the gray mare of Anaconda, and then there was the great California chestnut by the name of Cyclone. And Butte was bringing in horses from Chicago, from California, from Colorado. They put them on the train and they haul them out here. And our meets in Butte eventually ran about 60 days. And in Anaconda, Daly had built a second track over there, the Anaconda Driving Park. It was completed in 1888. And so they could come out here and spend the whole summer. They could run 60 days in Butte, another 30 days in Anaconda. And basically after that, if it snowed, probably kind of wipe them out. But if they wanted to, they could stay around for meets in other towns as well. Bob Wade's quarter-mile record was 21 1/4 seconds for 440 yards, and that record was set on August 20th, 1890, and it stood for 68 years. And so that was quite amazing. He was owned by a gentleman by the name of H. Sutton, who lived in Walla Walla, Washington, and they just decided it was time to get these 3 horses together, and Bob Wade won. He went on to have a remarkable record. After that, he raced in at least 8 other states. We lose track of him about 1894. By that time, he was racing in the Midwest. We don't know what happened to him at the end of the day, but he may have, gone on to just be somebody's riding horse or something like that. The year his record was broken was 1958. It was a horse called Red Jones. Under modern racing conditions with more modern timers, modern starting gate and everything, he ran a quarter mile in 21 1/5. So he shaved 1/20th of a second off of Bob Wade's record. Barely broke the record. And if anybody's curious, today the quarter mile record was set in 2009 at Southern Park, New Mexico, and that was 20 1/4. So they've shaved maybe a quarter, they've shaved maybe a second off the record since 1890. The involvement of Marcus Daly was kind of fascinating because in 1896, he just flat out bought the track. And I don't know if Lee Mantle still owned it by then or who, but I wasn't able to drill down on that. But Daly bought the track. And your monument over at Racetrack Park and some other records say that he withdrew from active management. What he did is that he hired a world-class expert. And the gentleman he hired was named Ed Tipton. Are there any people in here that are into horse racing, thoroughbreds, quarter horses? If you're into thoroughbreds, the name Chieftain rings a bell because the basic Chieftain Thoroughbred Sales Company today is one of the outfits that runs those huge yearling sales in Kentucky where they're selling young thoroughbreds for millions and millions of dollars. Ed Tipton started that company along with some business partners. So Tipton came out from Kentucky, hired by Daly. He managed the Butte track, he managed the Anaconda track, he did a lot of business management advice for the Bitterroot Stock Farm, and was out here for several years. And Ed Tipton, one of the things that Daly was very good at was hiring really top-class folks. So, this was the Anaconda Grandstands. This was the Anaconda driving park, two-story grandstand built in 1896. He operated this track 30 days every year for trotting and running races. It survived Daly's death for a while. It was part of the county fairgrounds. Unfortunately, in 1911, it burned down, probably arson. We've never seen that happen before. But fire started in 2 different places at once, so somebody was sad about that. Horse racing was, kept on going, though they actually threw up bleachers within a couple of days so they could finish the meet. But unfortunately, after that, they didn't have the money to rebuild it, and now that area is part of both Washoe Park and the second western addition over in Anaconda. If you drive around that neighborhood, you'll find streets named Tammany, Hammer, and Longden. Those were all Marcus Daly's horses, so we still have a memory of the Anaconda Park. Of course, is that Mount Hagen that you can see in the back there? I think is that the peak over there? So that's the Anaconda track. Now to jump over to what Marcus Daly was doing in western Montana, he started the Bitterroot Stock Farm. He purchased the land in the late 1880s. By 1892, he had a remarkable thoroughbred operation. By 1893, he had this horse named Tammany, and by 1894, Tammany was a renowned champion and not only Daly's favorite horse, but the king of the stock farm. If a couple of paintings of him exist, the one that you're looking at in color was painted by Henry Stoll and hangs at the original governor's mansion in Helena right now. The photograph is at the Bitterroot Stock Farm. That barn, you can see the taxidermy mounts, everything else, that's just Tammany held by one of his grooms there. The floor was cork. The walls, the legend says his walls of the stall were lined with velvet. I don't think so. Horses would mutilate velvet wall coverings, but they may have been carpet. They may have taken old carpet and put it up there so nothing would bump him, nothing would mar his perfection. He was absolutely loved by Daly and survived after Daly passed. The stock farm in Hamilton grew to 22,000 acres, housed at its peak 1,200 horses, thoroughbreds, standardbreds, draft horses, Shetland ponies, you name it. If it had 4 legs and it whinnied, he probably had at least a few. After Daly passed away in 1900, almost all of his horses were sold to settle the estate, and the thoroughbreds were taken to Madison Square Garden in New York City, and they sold in 1901 dollars. The total sale was about $750,000 in 3 days, with the dispersal of Daly's thoroughbreds. Tammany was sold at that sale about $8,000. Daly loved him half to pieces. His pedigree was pretty darn good. The Kentucky Blue Bloods were maybe not as impressed with him as they were with some of Daly's other horses, but he did sell. He did produce some offspring after the sale, and we don't really know his ultimate fate, but he did live to be a fairly old horse. In Anaconda, Daly memorialized Tammany, and how many of you do remember the Tammany Bar at the Montana Hotel? This mosaic still exists. They saved it. And it is currently at the Daly Mansion in Hamilton. I took that picture in color, so I saw it with my own eyes. And the picture on the black and white was from Minor Shoebotham's book. and showing you the context of it on the floor of the bar in Anaconda. So anybody have any stories? I mean, the legend is that Marcus Daly said nobody could step on that mosaic. If you did, you had to buy a round of drinks for the house. That was your penalty. I talked to some other people. They said Louis Mittner was one of the great old bartenders there. You know, kind of kept that, buy a round of drinks on the house if you step on the mosaic. Somebody said by the 70s when that place started to fall apart, they were just saying don't step on it, it's bad luck. I don't know. Do you have any stories on that you can elaborate about? Any of you, those of you that were giving me that knowing nod, can tell me any stories about that mosaic when it was on the floor? Yes?
Well, only that it impressed me that all around it, the floor was worn, and yet actually, although it was embedded right in the floor, it was quite pristine.
So it stayed, yeah. So people really did walk around it and never step on it. Yeah. So that was just a fun part of our Butte-Silver Bow history, was the way that Daly immortalized Tammany. As Daly passed away, the track management still continued. By this time, the meet was so big and so well known, and horses came in from all over the country, that the ownership of the track shifted around a little bit. This particular photo, though, was of the jockeys at the Butte meet in 1905, and I always just sort of love to look at those old faces and the old equipment and the different racing silks, different stables. At one point in time, some of the race meets, they had 750 horses on the grounds. And because we all know what Butte was like around 1900, there wasn't a lot of grass growing here. And so one of the things that had started with Daly, but then continued after his death, is they shipped not just hay from the Bitterroot, they actually would take out a mower, and they'd cut fresh grass. And they'd put it on the train in the morning and run it over here so they could actually have some fresh grass for the race horses as well. There was nothing too good for the horses. I thought this was kind of a fun little article from the Daly Racing Farm, Ed Tipton. Those of you in the back, you can't see the reading it, said that the prospects of Montana racing at the Anaconda meetings is keenly expressed. Tipton sends a telegram to the Daly Racing Farm saying, if Chicago owners think of shipping here, stop them unless they have good horses. Short distance, low class sprinters will not do. They are coming in by the hundreds. And so, bring us the good ones. Don't send your scrub line out here. You better bring in decent horses. This is a Sanborn map that's at the Montana Historical Society in Helena, showing some of the layout of the track. And, you saw the 1903 map. This particular layout, it's kind of an odd structure. But basically, the grandstands that we saw in the photo is the middle of these three buildings. You can see some of the barns here going up. They have an inset showing the 8 cookhouses. The track is right here. You can see the curve up a ways to give you a sense of how it was laid out. When I was here doing my research, I was told there is a house on Howard Street that has some evidence of having been part of this original track infrastructure. There was a ticket house, and you drive by it today and it looks like a house like all the other houses. It's had some work done, but apparently it is an original structure that remained even when the track got torn down.
Yeah, they used to call it the racetrack bar.
Yeah, there's a neighborhood, the whole neighborhood now. Is there a bar too? Okay. Yeah, I'm always interested in hearing a little bit more. That whole neighborhood that's called Racetrack was basically the grounds. By this time, the organization was renamed the Butte Jockey Club, and again, I think they were running long before they legalized themselves, but articles of incorporation were filed in 1908. Butte in 1906 had another round of world records that were set, and these didn't hold quite as long, but a thoroughbred named Atoka was an expert racer at 3 furlongs, which is 3/8 of a mile, and he did the really interesting thing of breaking the world record twice at the same meet on the same track. And it was a really interesting story because his jockey was named Lon Sparger, and his other owner was just named, his last name was Stokes, that's all we've got, or not, yeah, Stokes and Sparger. And first he broke a record by running three furlongs in 33 3/4 second. He won by a nose of a horse named Billy Mahan. Then the horse that came in third was named Sam F. And Sam F's owner was not a good sport. He was unhappy that he got beat. And so he challenged his Atoka a second time, about 3 weeks later. And Atoka beats Sam F again. And didn't break the record, but his owner was still upset and said, well, we've got to have a rematch, just the two of us, match race, no excuses, no conditions. And the owners of Atoka agreed to what they called catchweights, which meant nobody was going to weigh in the jockeys, except to say how much they were carrying so the bettors could make their bets. Well, Lon Sparger was full grown, he was an adult. And when he raced, he weighed in at 123 pounds, still pretty little guy. But the owner of Sam F found a kid that weighed 79 pounds and put him on Sam F. So then the race opens up on the 7th. Sam F starts out, he's ahead, he's 2 lengths ahead as they're coming in. It was a 3 furlong race, so they started on the backside, came around the turn, and then down the home stretch. And Sam F was ahead at the turn. But Atoka was pretty good at running turns, and he whipped around him in the final 50, it was the final 40 yards, won by 2 lengths, and this time he takes another quarter mile or quarter second off of his record, and so he breaks his own world record twice within a month, and it all happened in Butte. That particular record stood for 32 years, so it was still a pretty impressive accomplishment. Now, then we have trouble. Progressive era, we have a lot of reforms. Gambling is a moral vice. You know, prohibition's out there lurking on the horizon. In 1909, the legislature passed an anti-pool room law that said you could only bet at an enclosed racetrack or fairgrounds. Furthermore, races were limited to 30 days per county in counties of the first class, which was Silver Bow County. And it directly attacks Butte's 60-day race meet. They also limit racing in all other counties to 14 days, and the only other county racing more than 14 days was Anaconda. So it's a direct slap at the meet. Well, obviously the pool rooms were unhappy. And one of the folks that was very unhappy were the folks who owned the M&M. Imagine. The M&M has still sometimes hosted simulcasting even to the present day. They've got a history of horse racing that goes way back. So what they did is they hired a guy named Harry Rose, who opened up a telegraph office, just by pure coincidence, was upstairs on the second floor of the M&M building. And there was a back staircase. I think that area later got used as a speakeasy during Prohibition. I'm not sure. But Harry Rose had his little telegraph office open, and people would go up there and they would send business messages, you know. Glorio first at track odds, you know, whatever racetrack, $20. And so they'd be wiring these bets to the East Coast, and, you know, that didn't appear to be illegal. And then down in the bar, you had Ed Sylvester. And Ed, he had a separate telegraph line where you could just get in the news, just read the news off to folks. And he had a blackboard, and he was putting up the names of horses and their odds, and then these races would come in, and he was calling the races that came in, and everybody was cheering, and this was how we had just entertainment in the bar. No money, no betting, you know what, nobody's changing money here. And of course, somebody tipped off law enforcement, and they decided it was time to investigate. And so they came in and, you know, they saw Ed Sylvester's operation, and they couldn't find any evidence of illegal betting outside of an enclosed racetrack. And then they went upstairs, and Harry Rose, well, yes, certainly I've been sending these business messages all to the East Coast. They have nothing to do with what's going on in the M&M. Why, I knew nothing about the M&M except for one problem. There was a guy in the bar, had a bet on a horse named Intrinsic. Horse named Intrinsic was on Ed Sylvester's blackboard with his odds. The guy placed a bet on Intrinsic up at the telegraph office, and Rose and Sylvester were busted. They were convicted in jury trials. They both appealed to the Montana Supreme Court. The Montana Supreme Court upheld both convictions and said, oh yes, we're going to enforce this anti-pool room law. Harry Rose skipped town. Ed Sylvester got a little bit smarter, although about 5 years later he got nailed again for yet another illegal betting operation that he was running somewhere else. Then you have the tracks decide, you know what, we are going to test this 30-day law. And so they went out Harrison Avenue, somewhere, they call it on the boulevard south of town, however you want to define that, and they very quickly graded an oval, and a group called the Butte Driving Club organized, and they ran about 15, 20 days of horse racing out there, with wagers exchanged every day, just not very much, 15, 20 bucks, just enough to say that every day they had betting on the horse races. Then the Butte Jockey Club meets. And for the first couple of weeks, of course, it's still within the 30-day limit, but then we get to day 17 of the meet, which is day 32 of racing for the county, and you have the secretary of the Butte Jockey Club, this guy named William Gemmel, and he places a bet on a horse. Well, he happens to be hanging out with the county attorney, Thomas Walker, and Walker declares that it's day 32 for racing, and Gemmel just placed an illegal wager, and he had him arrested. Somebody asked Walker, well, weren't you betting on the races too? And Walker said, well, if I didn't, it was something unusual. So Gemmel gets convicted, and he doesn't get convicted. The judge actually acquits him. The judge was Michael Dawson here in the district court in Somerville County. And he said that this law with this 30-day limit meant 30 days per track, so Gemmel didn't do anything wrong. And of course, gets appealed to the Montana Supreme Court. In 1912, the Supreme Court says, 30 days means 30 days, and they reinstated Gemmel's conviction. So then he goes back to Judge Donlin, who acquits him a second time, but this time he says, well, what really was going on is that Butte Driving Club track, they kind of put a barbed wire fence around it, so it wasn't really enclosed. So it was an illegal meet, and all your bets don't count, so you were still, you didn't create an illegal bet with the Jockey Club. So one way or the other, Gemmel was off the hook. Donlin is trying to save racing for all he's worth. The legislature was not through. And they got tired of all these shenanigans, and so in 1915, the Montana legislature banned all gambling on any test of anything. You couldn't try to bet on gophers, you couldn't bet on horses, you couldn't bet on mules, you couldn't bet on dogs. It was any contest of speed or skill or endurance of animal or beast. I'm not sure the difference between an animal and a beast, but they wanted to make sure they had all bases covered. And so they banned horse racing. And unfortunately, that ended our beautiful Butte Jockey Club track. They couldn't make any money off of jackpots and small races. They couldn't attract purses. The California horses, the Chicago horses, they all quit coming. And eventually, everything was torn down. The place was sold off in lots. And so today, we have the racetrack neighborhood. Parimutuel bills failed 3 times. And in the meantime, the Butte Driving Club, they took their old little, not really enclosed track, And they did expand it a little bit, and so what horse racing ran in Butte was now running out the Butte Driving Club track is probably about where the airport is today. I was surfing around with Google Earth looking for ovals out there. There's an old car racetrack that's a little bit south of the airport. May or may not be about the same place. I'm not sure. It would take somebody who knows more about the local scene than I do to answer that question. But so they did have a track. And if they ran races, officially the races were being run for jackpots, which is okay. You could pull the entry fees and then pay the entry fees to the winning horse. And of course, we all know wagering was going on under the table. A couple of young guys made their way through Butte during this period. One of them was about a 15 or 16-year-old kid named Johnny Pollard. He didn't do too well out here racing and exercising horses. He did a little boxing on the side to earn money. But he was redhead, and so he picked up a nickname. He became Red Pollard, and about 10 years later he met up with a horse named Seabiscuit and became a very famous jockey. Another young man, also from Canada, these guys were both born in Canada, who went on to become a Hall of Fame horse racing jockey, won the Triple Crown on Count Fleet, was Johnny Longden, and he came through here about 1929 when he was but a lad of 17. Also didn't win any races in Butte, although he did win some up in Shelby and a foot race also. So we had some brushes with fame. In 1929, there was a couple of interesting things happened. I'm just checking here. As you can see, this was the second Butte track. They called it Marcus Daly Park. And probably this was, again, some of the local folks here, since some articles had indicated this was somewhere by the airport, where it is today. And this track was probably the Butte Driving Club track, expanded and improved. We had a few developments that allowed horse racing to come back. The first time was in 1926, this time they sent it over to Helena, and the Helena lawyers started scratching their heads about how are you going to get horse racing betting legalized. And they looked at the pari-mutuel wagering system, which was not real popular in 1915, but it had been growing in popularity since then because it was more honest than working with a bookie. And they came up with this thing they called the Florida Plan. And it was a pari-mutuel wagering system in all but name. You would go to the track, you would buy a share in a racehorse for $5. Then you would go to the window and you would pay $2 to enter your share of your horse in the race. And then all that money was pooled, and if your horse won, that was the jackpot, and jackpots were legal. So then you collected your share of the jackpot. Well, they tested this out in Helena. Edward Toomey, he happened to be chief counsel for the governor, John Erickson. He placed a bet in Helena on a horse named Florence Fryer. Who doesn't love a horse named Florence Fryer? She lost. He sued the fair board and said they were conducting an illegal gambling operation. Well, the fair board chair was Penwell, and the case went up to the Supreme Court again. And now we have a new Montana Supreme Court, and they ruled unanimously in 1926 that the Florida Plan was perfectly legal, that it's legal to, jackpots are legal, horse racing is legal, this is fine. And at that point, they blast a hole in the anti-gambling law. It takes them a couple of rounds before they can legalize pari-mutuel wagering through the Montana legislature, but they get there, and that was the year that R. James Spear of Winnipeg opened the Marcus Daly track. He ran a huge meet in 1929. Will James was in town. The archives here have a photograph of Gary Cooper being in town. Lon Sparger, who rode a Toka, was getting on in years, but he'd show up at the track and tell the tale of the glory days to anyone who'd listen. And they had tremendous turnout. They had a lot of local horses. They had huge crowds. They actually pulled in pull up a statistic here. Trying to find my statistic here, and all of a sudden I can't read everything. Basically, there were 500 horses on the grounds, and the last day of the meet, the crowd was estimated at 8,000 people. So that was the kind of numbers they drew. Of course, that year the stock market crashes. Spears still manages to pull together about a 2-week meet in 1930, then he runs out of money. Someone else, James Hills, I think it was his nephew or his grandson, bought the land, pulled together a meet in 1936. Walter Hill, this is James Hill's son. Runs a meet in 1936, but after that, guess what? Somehow these, by mysterious origin, those grandstands burned down, and that land was sold too. So that marks the end of horse racing in Butte of any kind of legal, organized manner. But I thought it was interesting to do a little then and now. And the picture present day, I shot this a few months ago. I was standing in the parking lot of the Copper King Inn and put that up against the Marcus Daly Park image. And you can see that some things have changed a great deal and other things not so much. And today, we also still have Racetrack Park over on Farragut Avenue. And I took some pictures of the park, and they have a little monument to the old grandstands in their glory days there. So that is our, that's what we have, that's our talk. And this time, I'd like to open up to questions, comments, historical anecdotes. Yes. 10,000 people in Anaconda. That would not surprise me. It would not surprise me at all. They also had a trolley line throughout the track. Yeah, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have television. It was definitely, I think it's a big deal. It was a great social thing as well. They had 2 restaurants. They had a bar. It was a pretty big grandstand. Questions, comments? Yes, in back.
Can you put up that map that you had, just one of your first slides, and show what the streets are? Because you showed the trolley line.
I'll see if I can expand that a little bit. I'm not sure if I can make how big I can make that on here. Let's see if I can.
Because is that Grand Avenue that's up above the trolley line?
Let me put on my glasses. I don't think I can make this any bigger.
Does it show Howard on there?
Yeah, the line over here. Okay, this is marked Northern Pacific. This railroad thing there is
Right.
Northern Pacific. The one that says trolley line that's above the track, they don't have those streets marked. If you look at the Silver Bow Creek and you see that group of buildings that how the impoundment ponds, there's the little thumb that's sticking up there like this. The buildings there are marked Parrot.
Right.
So that's the Parrot tailings. I figured out, I was looking at a different map that was here at the archives, and my guess on that one, I think the grounds of the track were bordered roughly, very, very roughly, by, I've got the, basically I think that Grant, Marcia, Howard, and Garfield are kind of the square that would encompass roughly where that track was. Grand, Marcia, Howard, and Garfield.
Okay.
I think.
Okay.
And there is a vertical file here that's labeled horse racing. It's got just a photocopy of the map that shows kind of the track oval that the street's coming in and starting to eat into it. I don't know if it was made in the 30s or when. There wasn't any other markings with the map. But so yeah, at this point in time, the streets are not, nothing's labeled until you get over here. So I don't. Yeah, I don't see any street names on here, so. Other questions? Yes?
Just a comment, I was looking now on the Montana Historical Society website, and they have some books and stuff that are scanned, and the library here has the Marcus Daly's stock, horse stocks with all the
catalog.
breeding histories and everything in them. And so I checked with the library just to see where they have it. Of course, they have it in the sequestered area. But you can actually see it online if you want to. Amazing how he had a number of horses and stuff that were Kentucky bred, okay? But also a number from England, like you said, as well as, I was surprised how many were associated with down in California, racing down in California.
The California connection with Marcus Daly was his partners in the Anaconda Company. I mean, James Manelli Hagan had a 40,000 acre horse ranch in California. And then as he retired, he sold his California ranch and bought Elmendorf Farm in Kentucky. Hagan was a horseman from, just like they said, they called it bred in the bone. And of course he helped fund the Anaconda Company. Also, George Perce was also a horseman. He built, I think it was Bayview. He built a racetrack in San Francisco. He owned some major thoroughbreds, won some of the big races back there. We don't have as much scuttlebutt on Lloyd Tevis, who was the third of those California partners in Anaconda. But Tevis had a very horsey family. And today, if there's anybody who is into endurance riding, there's a 100-mile Western States endurance ride in Southern California that's informally known by the name of its trophy, which is the Tevis Cup. So all three of these guys were horsemen very much as Daly was. And I think that when Daly got into, I think that my personal opinion is that Daly's interest and knowledge of horses predated, may have gone back to childhood, because he had a level of personal interest. There's a copy of his catalog, that stock farm catalog, over at the Daly Mansion that they guard with their lives, that actually has Daly's annotations written page by page what he thought of every horse. And Tammany was like nice horse, and then another one mean, don't like him. Ugly horse, good horse. Another one, sell this mare, foals are crazy. I mean, he had very, very precise and very accurate understanding of most of his individual animals, at least his very, very top quality ones. And so I think that, he probably got a lot of business advice from his partners about everything, and no doubt included the horses. But he bought, he would try to buy, see very winning, very promising young horses back east, bring them out here, and then breed them. Now, Daly's most famous racehorse, we do have another claim to the Triple Crown, was Scottish Chieftain. And Scottish Chieftain won the Belmont Stakes. And so it was an interesting story because his horse Longden was supposed to win, but Longden had a bad day, and the Chieftain was supposed to be what they call the rabbit, the one you run out in first to kind of fool everybody else into bringing up all their speed. Well, Chieftain just decided it was his day to win the race, and Longden wasn't having a good day. I think he finished last. And in the meantime, all the East Coast horses were chasing the Chieftain, and he came in first. And so that was kind of an interesting thing. Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, I read one time in one of the newspapers articles back in, it had to be the late 1800s, that Marcus Daly had a horse. They ran in New York somewhere back east, and it was 40 to 1 in the morning line, and he got $1,000 to win on it. And the ticket was supposedly in his coat pocket, and in the mine when it got mine caught on fire.
Yep, I've heard that one too. I think the horse he bet on might have been Montana, but yes, he would have had a $40,000 winning ticket, he left in his coat and the place burned down, is that what happened? Or I've heard two stories, one that the coat went to the cleaners and one was that the place caught on fire.
That's the one
I've heard the caught on fire is, more reliable story, but yeah, that's, like you can imagine that Daly,
But back then, $1,000 a game.
that was a lot of, but it's still a lot of money.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did that a lot. Any other stories, questions? Yes.
Remember a racetrack in the lower west side?
Lower West Side?
Above Iron, west of one.
I think there's a dog track up there. Highland?
There's well, I worked over there in Guysboro,
Mm-hmm.
the new work. This is 30 years ago. It's a big old building, way bigger than the road. But he claimed, he told me, that was the original barn for the horse track that was over there.
It's, that, the Butte Driving Club track, that's the biggest mystery track to me. This one pretty clearly was on Harrison Avenue, somewhere out there. But the fake track that they did up when they were testing the 30-day law, they just sort of graded something and ran the races, and then somehow they kind of kept that going and ran some races into the 20s. All I have on that is if they called it On the Boulevard South of Town, and I kind of wonder if that was that location. I don't know.
Yeah, this is above Iron.
Oh, okay. Okay, so it's,
And the building is built.
okay. It's worth looking at. There was also quite a dog racing community here too. The greyhound racing was big, and there was a greyhound track, and for a while I was going down the wrong rabbit hole, so to speak.
It was south of in the 50s.
Was that where it was?
It was south of the
Okay. Because there's just so many different, and these tracks move around as well. I saw another map that I can't bring up for you right now, but there's another Butte map that shows some kind of an oval, and it might have been a dog track over on the northwest side of town, kind of above Tech somewhere over there. And I don't know if that was there was a dog track called the Highlands track, but I have no idea. After a while, somebody told me, you've got to stop researching, you've got to start writing. But yeah, so it would be really interesting to see, because I love to go around the world. Any other questions?
No.
Oh, yeah.
Just a point of interest, horse racing, at that time, like you say, and everyone dressed up to go to the horse races.
Oh, yeah.
Thus, Grand Avenue, that's why it was
Okay.
named Grand Avenue.
That was where everybody was.
That's where you went to the racetrack.
So you think that might have been where that trolley line might have run along Grand Avenue then, perhaps? I don't know.
And from what I can figure out, the ticket booth to get into the track was right about where the racetrack fire hall sits right
Okay.
now.
Okay. Well, the racetrack fire hall is,
Corner of Grand and Perce.
yeah, right there. Yeah.
There you go, yeah.
Yeah, that could have been, I mean, one of the things about a racetrack is a mile oval is 40 acres of open land. And, when you find open land that you don't expect to find open land, they always make it into a ball field, a parking lot, or a car racetrack, one of the three. But in this particular case, we're not that far from East Middle School, there's a lot of athletic fields and stuff over there, so, that encompassed a pretty good chunk of land.
The abstract for my house shows that track perfectly,
Wow.
because they drew in all the neighborhoods and the streets and stuff, so it's a very good map.
That's good. So probably up at the clerk's office, the county clerk, or the clerk. Thank you so much. We're on the clock, so I'll go ahead and call it a day here, turn off the mic. If anybody else wants to continue to talk, I'll stay on board. Thank you.
Cool, very good.